This is A New Angle, conversations about how we're doing and where we're going. I'm your host, Justin Angle. This show is supported by the Headwaters Foundation, First Security Bank, and the University of Montana College of Business. Hey folks, welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. Today, I'm speaking with Megan Torgerson, creator and host of Reframing Rural, a podcast celebrating rural people and their stories. Megan and her team recently launched their fourth season, Succession Stories. Megan, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Justin.
So tell us, where did you grow up and what did your parents do?
I grew up south of Dagmar, Montana, which is a tiny unincorporated community in the far northeast corner of the state.
Okay.
So I went to school in Medicine Lake. People are maybe a little bit more familiar with that.
How big was your school?
There were 100 people K through 12. Mm-hmm. Today there are about 80 people K through 12. And we co-opted with the town of Freud for sports. So the Freud Medicine Lake Red Hawks.
Yes.
Yeah, and people might be familiar with Freud at this moment. A local immigrant and business owner, Roberto Orozco, was arrested by Border Patrol. So that corner of northeast Montana has been in the news a little bit, but he's a staple in the community. My dad had trucks repaired by him numerous times, so if people are following that case. And that answers kind of the next question. Yeah, my parents were farmers and ranchers. My dad retired in 2022, and we are dryland wheat farm, cow-calf operation, like a lot of places out there. And then my mom supported the farm and ranch, and really her role in agriculture doesn't often get a lot of credit, but she did things like running to town for parts at John Deere or serving hot meals out in the field, helping shuttle machinery between, different properties and picking rock, all sorts of things.
Sure. Picking rock. Talk more about that. It sounds like a very specific task.
That's a fun one. You have a rock picker that you pull behind a tractor, and then you go through the field before seeding to pick up any large boulders. A lot of glaciers moved through where I grew up, and so there's lots of glacial erratic and other rocks that are deposited that come up every year, every spring, that you have to clean up out of the field before seeding.
Yeah. So how big is your family ranch?
Yeah. People, I guess I grew up learning that you shouldn't ask that question.
Oh, okay.
Because it's like asking someone how much money you have in the bank.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So I'll pass on that question.
Yeah. So what is the correct nomenclature? Like small, medium, large? Like I'm trying to situate your family's participation in the industry in some distribution of what that industry looks like in the state.
Sure. It's, I guess, more of a large-scale farm.
Okay.
And people who are predominantly in farming and agriculture today have to, have multiple thousands of acres to make a living in agriculture. So farms are getting a lot bigger. And I would say you'd need about 5,000 acres to make a living farming in the area, but there's now farms that are up to 20,000 acres in Sheridan County.
Okay.
And they have a lot of like H-2A employees and staff that's helping them with those operations. But
great. So you come to undergraduate school here at the University of Montana, study English, and then was it directly off to Seattle University?
No, it was a circuitous route. So I studied English with a creative nonfiction emphasis. And then I went to Portland, Oregon, where I worked for an amazing nonprofit called Northwest Documentary.
Okay.
Yeah, and we taught documentary filmmaking lessons and nonfiction storytelling. And then I met my now husband, who was living in Asheville, North Carolina at the time. So I moved all the way across the country to Asheville.
Right.
Yeah, and then I was really missing kind of working in arts and culture nonprofits and living in the West. And I remembered this university program that I'd heard about when living in Portland, and it was Seattle University's MFA Arts Leadership Program.
Okay.
And so then we moved back to the Northwest into Seattle, where I was at for 5 years, and started Reframing Rural in grad school.
Right. So this is part of your graduate work, Reframing Rural. Talk about that genesis story. What is Reframing Rural? How did it come to be?
Sure. So the kind of seed for the idea of Reframing Rural really started in 2016 when I was seeing rural communities being represented as a political monolith in the news a result of the 2016 election.
Sure.
Yeah, and I didn't have the language for this then, but also a kind of a genesis of Reframing Rural is this kind of concept called urban normativity, which shares that urban is seen as normal, culturally important and relevant, and rural, in contrast, is viewed as unreal, unnormal, or culturally deviant. And so a lot of like growing up, I didn't see a lot of really complex stories about rural America in film or in TV or sometimes in the media. And so just doing kind of a discursive analysis on how rural was represented in the media and in culture, I decided I wanted to create a podcast that addressed those things. And yeah, it wasn't like, I thought I was seeing an overly politicized narrative of rural, and I didn't want to like get into politics, but I just wanted to shine light on rural stories with complexity and care, given my background.
So I want to press on that phrase you used a moment ago, is seen as. So are you talking about just the way the media portrays this sense of what normal is, that normative portrayal?
Yeah, I guess media or film oftentimes.
Okay.
Like there's this book.
Culture in general,
Culture
I
in
suppose.
general. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And so also let's embed it in the title of the project, Reframing Rural, is the perhaps the assumption that an existing frame is inadequate. In your mind, what was that existing frame? You sort of glossed over it a little bit with political monolith, but talk about this existing frame that you thought was perhaps an inaccurate caricature.
Sure. I think it was dominated by caricature and stereotypes. And so, you think of like the slack-jawed yokel in The Simpsons, or, Duck Dynasty, or kind of some of these images that really that dominate the rural narrative. I guess when I first left Montana, I met people who had never met a person from a rural place. And so I also encountered stereotypes of like people thought, oh, you grew up on a farm, that means you must have grown up in poverty. Or someone was like, your story seems like a work of fiction, like you'd be a character in a book. Which is kind of insulting because, of course, I'm not a character in a book, and there are, lived experiences like, similar to mine as well.
Yeah.
But does that answer the question?
I think so. I guess it's a hard one to get out without going too head on into politics.
Yeah. Well, I was interviewed by 56 counties the other day, and I was feeling really pissed off. And I said, I was also tired of hearing that people think that all rural Americans were Trump Republicans.
Right.
Because that's not the case, and that's not the household that I was brought up in. And so I wasn't talking about the political background of my guests, but I wanted to portray a different image that butted up against those stereotypes.
So you set out on this project of trying to basically add richness, right? To sort of portray the complexity that exists in humans and communities, regardless of their size, their location, their intensity, or their density. Yeah. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I would say that's accurate, definitely.
And having lived the experience of being stereotyped yourself, what sensibility did you bring to that initial season? Like what was the sort of guiding principle that you were trying to bring about in that first season?
I think in the first season, I was thinking a lot about the urban-rural divide,
yeah,
which I know is like a catch-all phrase for geography and politics, but I was just really wanting to tell stories, I guess, that kind of shared the common ground that people had. And so, asking them about what they thought of when they thought of home and what their community meant to them. And the whole first season is set in my hometown of Dagmar.
Yeah.
And there's 10 people who live in the town proper today. And I actually was just working on a story that's coming out this spring with the Montana Media Lab in their obit project. Mm-hmm. And the story that I told was the obituary of a small town, which is kind of a follow-up to that whole first season of like the question of, is Dagmar dead?
Yeah.
And so part of I think the thing I was exploring with season 1 as well was that question. And speaking to people and learning more about their life kind of convinced me that it's not dead, but you're kind of hanging on by a shoestring when you have that small of a population and the only open business is the post office.
Yeah, describe that continuum. Like, what are, in your view and in this exploration, what constitutes aliveness for a community? What must it have for it to be considered alive?
That just makes me think of an extension agent once told me that in Montana, small towns are either dying or loved to death. And so I think you often see it in these two extremes of maybe you have tourism in a location and that's, buoying the businesses enough to make it stay alive and stay relevant. I guess a lot, what are kind of the harbingers of death in a small town? For my hometown, it was the school closing, the general store closing, the church burned down. That was the first thing that Danish immigrants built when they founded Dagmar. So any kind of local gathering places.
Your conception of aliveness, what I didn't hear in there was economic vitality or viability. How does that fit in to the equation in your view?
Could you restate that? Sorry.
So when you're describing this idea of a community being alive or dead or some form of transition between those two, what I didn't hear was some economic framework. The number of jobs or the tourism income or whatever the case may be. In your experience of across the seasons, how would you describe the economic piece or the forces that you've explored in the project so far?
Yeah, I think economics do play a really important role. And part of the decline of my hometown is that it's dependent on a single industry economy, agriculture. It's not very diversified. I guess thinking about one of the communities that I've done some work around, Win It, and I've done collaborations with the nonprofit Win It Aces. They have multiple areas that they're really buoying. So they're, helping ranching stay viable in the community by, having things like a grass bank. They're renovating businesses downtown so that people can rent out those spaces. And now they have a coffee shop, which they didn't have for a very long time. They built a community center. So I think they're coming at job creation from multiple angles and economic vitality from multiple angles, I think.
And what are some of those? So we've got, some urban so we've got some possibility for retail. We've got something of a service economy. You can see how a lot of those businesses would be hollowed out, and that is generally a story on a macro level that plays out across rural America. But you've explored pockets where the opposite is true, that some of these small, local, hyper-local in many cases, businesses are thriving.
Yeah, and I think White Sulphur Springs is another example too.
Red Ants Pants, the Red Ants Pants Festival.
Yes.
And you've collaborated with Red Ants, right?
Yes, I have. Yeah, I did a needs assessment actually with the Red Ants Pants Foundation, where I interviewed their community grant recipients. And I'm thinking through too, one of those things that really, one of the results that really stood out was that rural communities are struggling if they are depending on just one industry. Like in White Sulphur Springs, arts and culture is a really strong branch of their economy too.
So, as we've said before, you started this project with this idea of like, I want to bring a deeper understanding of these communities, and you have your experience of living in these communities, living your childhood, visiting, etc. But as you dug into the work, what surprised you? What stereotypes that you might have had were countered or expanded or blown up completely?
Whoa, that's a good question. What surprised me? I guess there were some frameworks that just really helped me to understand my history a little bit better.
Yeah.
Like I interviewed this rural sociologist from Minnesota, and he talked about the kind of two branches of rural stereotypes, the rural illicit and the rural idyllic.
Okay.
And that often...
You're going to have to define those things for us.
Yeah, definitely. That people often, they have this idyllic, picturesque, utopia version of rural in their mind. Or, kind of picture a mountain lake in western Montana.
Sure. It seems consistent with the miscast frame that motivates the entire project, right? This romanticism of rural communities.
Definitely. And then on the other hand, there's the illicit frame. And that's, thinking of the word illicit drugs or meth users or, people who move to rural communities to be recluses and to get out of society.
Simpletons. Exactly. Counterculture, whatever it is.
Yeah. So I think I've just gained a lot more, I've gained terminology that's helped me better understand my rural experience and, learning too about like, get bigger, get out, the Nixon era edict by then Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz that really told farmers that you needed to expand your operations or get out of agriculture. And so learning about that also helped me understand, why my community is dying. And my dad, for instance, like had to keep expanding the farm to be a certain size so that he could, remain viable in the industry. But what that meant was that he was around our family a lot less in the evenings. What that meant was that there were, 100 kids in the K-12 because there were fewer families farming too. So I think this project has enabled me to do a lot of research that's just helped me understand my hometown and the rural Montana a lot better.
Yeah, that need for growth and the consolidation that comes with it. I mean, that's a nice lead into Succession Stories, your fourth season, where you take a look at, I believe it's 5 families that are going through this complicated and emotionally difficult question of how do we pass the ranch to the next generation, whether that's in the family or not. I think the assumption is that most families prefer to stay in the family. But yeah, talk about the conceit of season 4, and maybe we can sort of highlight some of the learnings there.
Definitely. So in season 3, I told the story of my family's farm and ranch succession. And then when it Aces, we collaborated on an episode, and they asked if I would do a whole season on succession. And so we
should pause here, Megan, and just talk about When It Aces, because they've come up on the show before. I interviewed Josephine Marcotti and Dave Hoggy about their book, about the prairie, and When It Aces was a case study in that book. Talk about that nonprofit organization.
Yeah, When It Aces is just an amazing organization that a lot of people in rural economic vitality and grassland conservation look up to in the state. And they're a rancher-led nonprofit that has programs that are, keeping ranchers on the land, that are bolstering the community vitality of Winnett and opening up businesses and community centers. They're just incredible. Winnett is the only town in Petroleum County, which is the least populated county in the state, and they have less than 200 residents. Wow. So they're just a group of real go-getters. Yeah. So you do a story about When It or in collaboration with When It Aces at the end of season 3, and that launches into season 4. Correct. Yeah. So we identified families to interview for the season, and they did a lot of the fundraising for the season as well. And so we were really looking. There are a lot of resources out there for farmers and ranchers looking to get into succession. My family, for instance, used a workbook that MSU Extension put together. We all met on Zoom and answered all the questions, my sisters and I and parents, and then talked through the answers. There's a lot out there about business structure and taxes and really the technical aspects. But what we wanted to do something differently and really tell stories with deep emotional resonance and show show vulnerability. So the whole succession planning journey starts with families having conversations with one another. And so that's what we're really modeling through the season. And what makes succession hard outside of the economic dimensions? But is there a change across generations? Like, you're not taking over your family farm, at least not immediately. So what's kind of at the heart of or is there a simple story at the heart of these struggles with transition? Well, I guess one of the largest struggles at the core is this culture of reticence that we don't talk about succession. Yeah. And I think that the greatest generation, for instance, like my grandfather's generation, they didn't have workshops or podcasts where people were talking about this. No. So a lot of them didn't even broach the subject, and people found out what happened with their family, their parents' plans after they had passed. Yeah. So I think one thing that I'm seeing is people who are more my generation, I'm in my 30s, they're having conversations with their parents and they're encouraging them to have these conversations. But things that farmers and ranchers are up against, it varies really depending on the region. But for instance, in the Golden Triangle, I interviewed a few families from that area, farmers and ranchers, and the Hutterite colonies are buying a lot of the land in that area. And given that they're a colony, they have greater buying power than non-Hutterite families in agriculture. And so that's kind of making it difficult for some people. You need to expand still to remain viable in the industry. And so one family that I interviewed, they had a neighbor who decided not to sell to the Hutterites and sold the land that they owned just to local neighbors. And then in like Malta, another community I did an interview with, the Hammond family who I interviewed, at one point they were surrounded by 56,000 contiguous acres of land owned by out-of-state landowners.
Wow. Okay, so they were landlocked in a way.
Yeah, exactly. So just the buying power.
Yeah, this need for expansion that you've referenced a few times. I mean, that wraps into this succession story, I would imagine, in terms of, the viability of a small-scale operation manageable by a single family and its people. Those days are they gone?
Well, you are seeing a lot more people hire foreign labor from programs like H2A.
Yeah.
A lot of them are coming from South Africa, some from Denmark too. So yeah, they're needing to hire more people. And that program is amazing. And my cousin who's leasing out our land uses that program. But the challenge with that also is those people go back to their families after the farm season, so they don't have kids in the schools, and they're not adding population to these small communities. I guess one story is kind of runs counter to this get big or get out narrative in season 5, and that's with the Brewski family out of Ekalaka. And they were formerly farmers and ranchers, but they reseeded all of their land back into grass.
I think succession is interesting, and it has a lot of, it represents a lot of the economic challenges facing families, facing the industry, facing the state. There's a lot of reasons to care about it. Another frame could be like, why should I care about generational wealth in people I don't know? And should we?
Yeah, well, I guess food security is one answer to that.
Okay.
That the future of farms and ranches has an impact on all of us. Mm-hmm. But in response to your question, it also makes me think of this UK-based podcast that I listened to called Landed, and they were really arguing why land ownership at all. Like, if land was held in common, then we wouldn't have to worry about things like succession, and then we wouldn't have to worry about the next generation being maybe forced into farming or ranching if that's not something that they wanted to do. So the land would then be owned kind of by the community, and whoever would want to continue farming and ranching would be able to step into that opportunity and not be forced out of that opportunity because they don't own land. So it's a huge barrier getting into agriculture these days.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of like ranching leases from national forest lands. How are those sort of held in, are those part of succession? Like, can you pass those leases between one family to the next generation?
So in my understanding, you can. So where I grew up, we own all of the farm and pasture land.
Okay.
And so it's interesting. I think you hear a lot about eastern Montana being just rangeland, where the corner where I grew up is predominantly farmland, but people own the rangeland that they have. So in large parts of like around Malta or central and southeast Montana, I know that those BLM leases go along with the land. So if I'm say selling you my land, I think those leases often go with it as well.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears and talk about this film project that you've been an integral part of. Mother Range debuted in February at the Big Sky Film Festival. Yeah, talk about the experience of getting into film. Was this your first time in film?
This was my first time in film.
Okay.
Yeah, and also it was fun with telling the succession stories, which were all about families passing on to families. Mother Range features 2 first-generation women ranchers.
That means they are the first to do it. They have not inherited the land, or they're not part of a ranching family.
Yeah, so the 2 ranchers, Amber Smith and Jamie Stoltzfus, both of their husbands grew up in ranches, but neither of them returned to their family operations. And so Amber Smith, she is also the co-director of the national nonprofit Women in Ranching.
Okay.
And she ranches north of Miles City in a very tiny community called Cohagen. And so the film explores the collaboration that Amber and Jamie have. So Amber, on the plains of eastern Montana, has great calving ground. Okay. And so they have calves that are born on her ranch, and then they are sent to Jamie's ranch in the Absaroka Mountains south of Big Timber and McLeod. And so Jamie has a meat label called Cowgirl Meat Company. Yeah, so she does grass finishing there and ultimately sells direct to consumer. So they're bypassing the commodity market, and really it's been inspiring to see how first generation ranchers, they're unburdened by expectations of what ranching is supposed to look like. And they're thinking on like a landscape scale, as Amber talks about, like they're thinking not just what they can do with their land, but also what their neighbor, who's like hundreds of miles away, what they can collaborate and do together with both of their land bases.
So when you say defying expectations, like when you go, having grown up in ranching and now immersed yourself in the course of making Reframing Rural over the last several years, when you make contact with some sort of newcomers to the industry doing things differently, what sort of things are they doing differently? And were there things that like surprised you or made you scratch your head or opened your mind in some new way?
Yeah, I guess Amber and Jamie are that perfect example. Like most people do just sell through the commodity market, and I've never seen a collaboration across ranches like that.
Yeah.
And I guess the Brewski family, which I spoke about briefly, they are multi-generational farmers and ranchers, but they're doing things totally differently. And, you know, it's so inspiring to see people really lean more into regenerative agriculture, and like the Brewskis and like Jamie and Amber too.
So pull the lens back, as it were, on this aspect of your development as a person telling stories, making content, all of this stuff. How did the film piece fit into your sort of portfolio of skills? Describe the experience.
Sure. So I was invited into the project by the director Anthony Pavkovich and co-producer Zach Altman, and they were hoping, to utilize my skills both in storytelling and storyboarding and creating a project from the ground up, and my fundraising skills as well. And given my background growing up on a farm and ranch, but it's a totally new world to work in film. Like if I'm doing a story and I forgot to ask someone a question, I can call them on the phone and record that conversation and use that tape. But with film, of course, you can't go back to, say, calving season in February.
Yeah, a lot harder.
Yeah. So you have to think through the scenes a lot more. And then the editing process, which I just helped with storyboarding, not directly with editing, but that is just a beast. And already working in long-form narrative audio editing, that is a beast. But video takes it to the next level.
Yeah, I think that's something that listeners to this show might not fully grasp. I mean, not all radio programs, podcasts are created equally. The amount of labor that goes into a longer narrative form piece of audio is incredible. I mean, this show, we have this conversation, we slice it up a little bit, but it's pretty low touch to get it out to the world. But a show like yours, a show like we made several years ago, Fireline, it's exponential, the amount of thought and labor that goes into packaging all that audio for listeners.
Yes. I think I know when a project is done when I've cried in the making of it. And it's not just because I'm crying, pulling my hair out, being in an editing cave, but just being able to tell stories with spending that much time on them. You also grow to love the characters so deeply and their stories that you that you can't help but break down at some point.
So there's a lot of people out there that ask me about making content, podcast, whatever it is. You had this idea, you made it into a thing, and it has created a career for you in a lot of ways. Just to talk about that experience. What were some key points that sort of made it happen? What tips would you give to somebody who has this idea and wants to bring it to life, but isn't sure they can make it their career?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It was nice that I was able to create the podcast in grad school. So the first season was really used towards my graduate thesis and summary project. So I didn't really have the pressure at that point to make money off of the first season. And then I was able to write grants and secure grants based off of the work that I had done. I had an example to give people. Sure. But in the beginning, for the first few years, I was contract grant writing for a dance company and choreographer in Seattle and working as a PR consultant.
So you were hustling.
I was hustling, for sure. So it took a couple of years before I could completely work on Reframing Rural. And still I work on projects that are related, like a needs assessment for the Red Ants Pants Foundation, using my skills.
Yeah, it's a delicate conversation sometimes with students. I mean, I feel strongly that people should be compensated for their labor. Yet at the same time, I have found great benefit to taking unpaid positions, to showing up, doing work, raising your hand. And, that also reflects a certain degree of privilege that I was in positions where I could do that. I had my basic needs taken care of, so I could take unpaid labor. Not everybody has those sorts of opportunities. But I do think there's something about, particularly in this space of content that we operate in, that you got to kind of just make stuff.
Yeah.
And it is a little scary to give it away, but as you said, once you put season 1 out there, you had a thing that then you could then use as proof of concept to get support to make more of that.
Exactly. And while I was making season 1 too, I was working at a nonprofit in Seattle, and they offered me the communications director position. And I could just remember sitting there thinking about that and being like, I'm going to be so bored marketing the same programs every year. And Reframing Rural was just had this little seed, and I really wanted to grow it. And so I even took out more student loans too, and was like, I'm going to go for it. I want to pursue that. And I think it was ultimately worth it too. I've started just by myself, and now I have we're a team of 5 working on it. So
okay, we'll talk about season 5 a little bit.
Sure.
So season 4 is out there. Listeners can make contact with it. You're working on season 5 now. What can you tell us about season 5?
Sure. So I've since become a mom in the last few seasons.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you. And have started working on season 5, Rural Motherhood.
Okay.
Yeah. So a few reporting trips that I've been on so far have been about rural childcare and also farm stress and maternal mental health. And so I'll be working on that season all of this year, and it'll be coming out in 2027.
Do you think there is somebody out there making a sort of bizarro version of your show? Is there somebody thinking, I'm going to reframe urban life? It's not all socialists and gang violence and all the stereotypes that, are flatten urban life. Do you think that project is happening?
I hope it is. And my best friend who lives in Missoula and grew up in Seattle, I was first starting Reframing Rural, she was like, Megan, you need to reframe urban too. And she had that idea, for the rural listener, I need to debunk the myths surrounding urban. Yeah. So I hope that project exists, and maybe that'll be a future season.
Maybe that sort of begs the question of, what do you know about your audience? Can you describe your reach? Have you been able to learn anything?
That is a hard question. I guess the IP addresses for the podcast analytics, I don't know if you've experienced this, but they are largely based on on large cities.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I approximate my listenership by looking at my website analytics. And so I have a really good reach across the whole state, eastern Montana and western Montana included. And then I guess I've engaged with some listeners through speaking engagements with Montana Farmers Union and MSU Extension and stuff like that. So I guess, yeah, I know that a lot of them are farmers and ranchers. A lot of them are also living in places like Missoula and Bozeman and Billings too.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Our last question, Megan, is when was the last time you changed your mind?
I guess I've changed my mind on what constitutes culture. I guess growing up, I kind of thought of, I don't know, film as culture or urban places as centers of culture.
Yeah.
And then in creating Reframing Rural, I've also gotten to know and love the cultures of specific small towns like Winnett, which is really friendly and open and hardworking, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I recently read a definition of culture as simply a shared story. And how you break that up into different pieces, I'm not quite sure. Like what constitutes, like, what's the unit of analysis? Who has to share it in order for it to become a culture? Can a family have a culture? Can two people in a partnership? Can a single person? I don't exactly know, but there is some scale variable in there that I think is important too.
And there has to be belonging, I think, in that equation.
I think so. You probably have to find belonging in that story some way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great way to close, Megan. I mean, what you are doing is exploring culture and how it can manifest in many different ways. It's a great program. I encourage listeners to check it out. We're excited to see where you go and what cool stories you find next, Megan. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to A New Angle. If you like what we do and want to support us directly, please consider a subscription at anewanglepodcast.com. A New Angle is recorded at Studio 49, a generous gift from UM alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. Our presenting sponsor is the Headwaters Foundation, working side by side with Western Montanans to improve the health of our communities. We are also supported by First Security Bank and the University of Montana College of Business, with additional help from CED, Drum Coffee, and Montana Public Radio. Keely Larson is our producer. Libby Riddle is our production assistant. And finally, John Brownell, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks made our music. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time.